She was told her place wasn't in the front until the pilot needed her to save everyone's life. Sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who holds your fate in their hands. This is the story of how prejudice almost cost 200 lives. The fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare cast harsh shadows across the departure gate as 14-year-old Lila Johnson clutched her worn aviation manual against her chest. Her fingers traced the dog-eared pages of advanced flight dynamics, while her eyes followed every aircraft that taxied past the massive windows. This wasn't just a hobby for Lila. Aviation was her oxygen, her escape, her future, carved in contrails across an endless sky. "Flight 447 to Miami, now boarding," the gate agent announced with practiced indifference. Lila's heart hammered as she approached the Boeing 737, her economy ticket damp with nervous sweat. She had saved every penny from her part-time job at the local diner to afford this trip to visit her grandmother. More importantly, she had managed to snag a window seat. For most passengers, it was just another cramped spot, but for Lila, that little oval window was her portal to the cockpit she dreamed of occupying one day. She settled into seat 12A, carefully placing her backpack in the overhead compartment. Her aviation manual lay open on her lap, displaying detailed diagrams of hydraulic systems and engine schematics. Around her, business travelers tapped furiously on laptops, while families juggled restless children and oversized carry-ons. "Excuse me." The voice cut through the cabin noise like ice. Lila looked up to see flight attendant Patricia Reynolds standing in the aisle, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her uniform pressed to magazine cover perfection. There was something in Patricia's pale blue eyes that made Lila's stomach clench. "This seat isn't available for you," Patricia said, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority mixed with barely concealed disdain. "You'll need to move to the back of the aircraft." Lila blinked, confusion clouding her features. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat, 12A. I have my boarding pass right here." She fumbled for the crumpled paper in her pocket. Patricia's lips pursed into a thin line. "I don't care what your boarding pass says. This section is for premium passengers only. You belong in the back." The words hit Lila like a physical blow. Around them, conversations began to quiet as other passengers turned to watch the exchange. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and something deeper, more painful. She recognized that look in Patricia's eyes, that tone in her voice. She had seen it before in teachers who assumed she couldn't handle advanced classes, in store clerks who followed her through aisles, in coaches who overlooked her for team positions. "But I paid for this seat," Lila said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saved for months." "Don't make this difficult," Patricia snapped, her professional mask slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "Move to the back where you belong, or I'll have security escort you off this plane." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Lila felt the weight of every stare, heard the uncomfortable shuffling of feet, saw the way other passengers looked anywhere but at her. A businessman in the aisle seat cleared his throat and pointedly raised his newspaper higher. A woman across the aisle whispered something to her husband behind a manicured hand. Nobody said a word in her defense. Lila's hands trembled as she gathered her belongings. The aviation manual slipped from her lap and hit the floor with a dull thud. Patricia made no move to help as Lila crouched to retrieve it, her face burning with humiliation. The diagrams and equations that usually brought her such joy now blurred through unshed tears. She walked the length of the aircraft in silence, each step echoing in her ears like a countdown to defeat. Other flight attendants busied themselves with pre-flight preparations, their eyes carefully averted from the quiet drama unfolding in the aisle. Lila finally reached the very back of the plane, settling into seat 34B between a snoring elderly man and a teenager with headphones blasting music so loud she could hear every word. The seat was narrower here, the armrests worn and stained. The engine noise was louder, the smell of jet fuel more pronounced. Through the small porthole window, she could barely see the wingtip. This wasn't the view she had dreamed of, saved for, planned around for months. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Lila opened her aviation manual again, trying to lose herself in the familiar comfort of aerodynamics and flight principles. She had memorized every page, every diagram, every formula. At home, she spent hours on her flight simulator, practicing approaches to airports around the world. Her bedroom walls were covered with charts, weather maps, and photos of aircraft she hoped to pilot someday. Her guidance counselor at school called it an unrealistic fantasy. Her classmates rolled their eyes when she talked about becoming a commercial pilot. Even her own mother sometimes looked at her with a mixture of love and pity, as if dreaming too big might somehow break her daughter's heart. But Lila held on to those dreams like a lifeline. Every night, she fell asleep imagining herself in a crisp pilot's uniform, making announcements over the intercom, feeling the weight of hundreds of lives in her capable hands. She studied weather patterns, memorized airport codes, and devoured every piece of aviation literature she could find. 2 years earlier, she had entered the National Youth Aviation Simulator Championship on a whim. The competition brought together young aviation enthusiasts from across the country to test their skills in highly realistic flight simulators. Most participants were older, from well-funded aviation programs at expensive private schools. Lila had scraped together the registration fee and taken a Greyhound bus to the competition in Dallas. She had won, not just placed, won outright against 200 other competitors. The victory had earned her a small article in Aviation Weekly magazine and a scholarship to a summer aviation camp. But more than that, it had proven to herself that her dreams weren't just fantasies. She had the skills, the knowledge, the instincts of a natural pilot. Now, cramped in the back of this aircraft while the flight attendant who had humiliated her served drinks to premium passengers in the front, Lila wondered if any of that mattered. The world seemed determined to remind her of her place, to clip her wings before she ever had a chance to use them. The flight to Miami was smooth at first. Lila tried to focus on her book, identifying the sounds of the aircraft around her. The slight change in engine pitch as they reached cruising altitude, the soft whoosh of the air conditioning system, the barely perceptible vibration that told her they were flying through light turbulence. She was so absorbed in her reading that she almost missed the first sign of trouble. It started as a slight shudder, barely noticeable above the normal aircraft vibrations, but Lila felt it immediately. Her head snapped up from her manual, her senses suddenly alert. Something was different in the engine's rhythm. The cabin lights flickered once so briefly that most passengers didn't notice, but Lila noticed everything. The shudder came again, stronger this time. A few passengers looked around nervously as their drinks sloshed in their cups. The teenager next to her pulled off his headphones and glanced out the window. "Is that normal?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Before Lila could answer, the aircraft lurched violently to the left. Overhead compartments rattled, passengers screamed as carry-on bags shifted and cell phones went flying. The plane seemed to drop out from under them for a terrifying moment before stabilizing again. Emergency lighting flickered on along the cabin floor. Oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling like yellow rubber jellyfish. The intercom crackled to life with Captain Morrison's voice, steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some technical difficulties and will be making an emergency descent. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of your flight attendants." Technical difficulties. Lila's trained mind immediately began running through possibilities. Engine failure, hydraulic problems, electrical systems malfunction. Her fingers tightened on her aviation manual as she tried to read the situation from the aircraft's behavior. Another violent shudder shook the plane. This time, the lights went out completely for several seconds before the emergency power kicked in, bathing the cabin in an eerie red glow. Passengers were crying now, some praying, others calling out for their families. That's when Patricia Reynolds came stumbling down the aisle, her perfect composure completely shattered. Her hair had come loose from its bun, her uniform was wrinkled, and her face was pale with terror. "Is anyone here a pilot?" she called out desperately, her voice cracking. "We need someone in the cockpit immediately." The question hung in the air like a prayer. Passengers looked around at each other with wild, desperate hope. A businessman raised his hand tentatively. "I have my private pilot's license," he called out. Patricia practically ran to him. "Thank God. Please, we need you up front right now." As they hurried toward the cockpit, Lila heard fragments of panicked conversation between Patricia and the businessman. "The first officer collapsed," Patricia was saying. "Some kind of medical emergency. Captain Morrison is trying to fly alone, but the systems are failing. We're losing hydraulics and he says he needs someone who understands the backup controls." The businessman's confident expression began to crumble as the reality of the situation hit him. I've only flown small aircraft. Cessnas mostly. I don't know anything about commercial systems." They disappeared into the forward cabin, leaving the passengers in the back to wrestle with their fear and the growing certainty that their lives hung by the thinnest of threads. 5 minutes later, Patricia reappeared, alone and even more frantic than before. "Anyone else?" she called out, her voice breaking. "Please, is there anyone else with any kind of aviation experience?" Silence. Lila felt something stirring in her chest, a combination of terror and purpose that she had never experienced before. She knew she should stay quiet. She was just a 14-year-old girl with a dream and some simulator time. What could she possibly do in a situation like this? But as she looked around at the terrified faces surrounding her, as she heard a baby crying in the front of the cabin and saw an elderly woman clutching a photo of what must have been her grandchildren, Lila knew she couldn't stay silent. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking. "I might be able to help," she said quietly. Patricia's eyes snapped to her, and for a moment, the same dismissive expression from earlier crossed her face, but desperation quickly replaced disdain. "What kind of experience do you have?" Patricia asked, grasping at straws. "I won the National Youth Aviation Simulator Championship 2 years ago," Lila said, her voice growing stronger. "I've logged over 3,000 hours in commercial aircraft simulators. I know Boeing 737 systems." It was a long shot, and everyone knew it. Simulator time wasn't the same as real flight experience. But as the aircraft shuddered again and the emergency lights flickered ominously, Patricia realized they were out of options. "Come with me," she said, and for the first time since boarding, there was no condescension in her voice, only desperate hope. The walk to the cockpit felt like a journey through a nightmare. Passengers reached out to touch Lila as she passed, some offering prayers, others simply seeking comfort in human contact. The woman who had whispered about her earlier now looked at her with tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, "my grandchildren are waiting for me in Miami." The cockpit door opened to reveal chaos. Captain Morrison sat hunched over the controls, sweat beading on his forehead as he wrestled with an aircraft that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The first officer slumped unconscious in his seat, an oxygen mask strapped to his face, while emergency medical equipment cluttered the small space. "Captain," Patricia called out, "I found someone who might be able to help." Captain Morrison turned, and Lila saw her own shock reflected in his eyes. He had been expecting another adult, another professional pilot, not a teenage girl with a backpack and a dog-eared aviation manual. "How old are you?" he asked bluntly. 14, Lila replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I know these systems, Captain. I've studied them for years." Captain Morrison looked at the maze of controls surrounding him, at the red warning lights flashing across his instrument panel, at the unconscious man beside him. They were 40,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, losing hydraulic pressure, with backup systems failing one by one. In 20 minutes, he would have to attempt a landing at the nearest airport with limited flight controls and no co-pilot. He looked back at Lila, this young girl who had materialized from the back of his aircraft like an answer to a prayer he hadn't dared to make. "What do you know about emergency hydraulic procedures?" he asked. Lila's mind raced through the information she had memorized from countless hours of study. "If we've lost the main hydraulic systems, we still have the manual reversion capability for primary flight controls. But we'll need to compensate for the reduced control authority, especially during approach and landing. The backup electrical trim should still be functional if we can isolate the fault in the main system." Captain Morrison stared at her for a moment, processing her technical knowledge. It was exactly what he needed to hear, spoken with the precision of someone who truly understood aircraft systems. "Can you handle the radio communications while I focus on flying?" he asked. Lila nodded, sliding into the first officer's station. Her hands found the radio controls with practiced ease, and she began coordinating with air traffic control while Captain Morrison fought to keep the aircraft stable. "Miami Center, this is Flight 447 declaring an emergency," she said into her headset, her voice remarkably calm despite the chaos around her. "We have an incapacitated crew member and are experiencing multiple system failures, requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport for emergency landing." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of technical troubleshooting and careful coordination. Lila called out instrument readings, monitored system warnings, and managed communications with ground control, while Captain Morrison used every ounce of his experience to keep the damaged aircraft flying. Together, they worked through emergency checklists, isolated failing systems, and prepared for what would be one of the most challenging landings of Captain Morrison's 30-year career. Lila's simulator training proved invaluable as she helped him configure the aircraft's backup systems and calculate approach speeds for their compromised condition. As they began their descent toward Miami International Airport, Lila found herself thinking about all the people depending on them. The crying baby in first class, the elderly woman with her grandchildren's photo, the businessman who had tried to help, even Patricia, who had treated her so cruelly just hours before. On final approach, Captain Morrison announced, his hands steady on the controls despite the sweat dripping down his face. "Lila, I need you to monitor our airspeed and altitude. Call out any deviations." The runway lights stretched out before them like a lifeline in the darkness. Lila watched the instruments with laser focus, calling out readings as they descended through the night sky. "Airspeed 140, altitude 2,000 feet, she reported. "Rate of descent 800 feet per minute. 120 knots, 1,000 feet. 110 knots, 500 feet. Runway in sight." The aircraft touched down with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves through the cabin. But they were down, safe, alive. Captain Morrison engaged the emergency brakes and brought the aircraft to a stop as fire trucks and ambulances raced alongside them, their lights painting the tarmac in brilliant reds and blues. In the cabin behind them, 200 passengers erupted in cheers and applause. People were crying, laughing, hugging strangers, calling their loved ones to say they were alive. Captain Morrison turned to Lila, this remarkable young woman who had appeared in his darkest hour and helped him bring everyone home safely. "I don't know how to thank you," he said simply. "You saved us all." Lila felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for the first time all day, they weren't tears of humiliation or anger. They were tears of joy, of pride, of a dream realized in the most unexpected way possible. As the passengers began to disembark, Captain Morrison took the intercom microphone and made an announcement that would change Lila's life forever. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. I want you all to know that today's safe landing was made possible by an extraordinary young woman named Lila Johnson." When our first officer became incapacitated, Lila stepped forward and served as my co-pilot during this emergency. Her knowledge, skill, and courage under pressure helped save all of our lives. The applause from the cabin was deafening. As Lila walked down the aisle toward the exit, every single passenger stood to applaud her. The businessman who had tried to help earlier clapped her on the shoulder and told her she was remarkable. The elderly woman with the grandchildren's photo took her hands and whispered blessings. Parents held up their children to see the girl who had brought them home safely. At the aircraft door, Patricia Reynolds waited. Her earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by shame and gratitude. When Lila approached, Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said quietly. "More than an apology. I was wrong about you. So completely, terribly wrong." Lila paused, looking at this woman who had humiliated her just hours before, who had tried to make her feel small and out of place. She thought about responding with anger, about pointing out the injustice of what had happened, about making Patricia feel the shame that she had felt. Instead, she smiled. "Thank you for moving me to the back of the plane," Lila said gently. "If I had stayed in my original seat, I might not have been in the right place when you needed help." Patricia stared at her in amazement, overwhelmed by the grace and maturity of this young woman she had so badly misjudged. As Lila stepped off the aircraft and onto the jetway, she was met by reporters, airport officials, and representatives from major airlines who had already heard about what happened. In the days that followed, her story would make international headlines. Scholarships would pour in from aviation schools around the country. Airlines would offer her internship programs and guaranteed positions upon graduation. But in that moment, as she walked through the Miami terminal with her worn aviation manual tucked under her arm, Lila Johnson simply felt like a girl whose dreams had just become reality. She had proven to herself and to the world that skill, knowledge, and courage mattered more than prejudice or assumptions. She had shown everyone, including herself, that sometimes the person others underestimate is exactly the person who can save the day. The next morning, aviation news websites ran headlines about the teenage hero who co-piloted emergency landing. The story spread across social media, inspiring millions of young people to pursue their dreams regardless of the obstacles they faced. Patricia Reynolds submitted her resignation the following week, unable to continue in a job where she had allowed her prejudices to nearly prevent a hero from being in the right place at the right time. And Lila Johnson. She kept studying, kept dreaming, and kept working toward the day when she would sit in the captain's seat of her own aircraft, knowing that she had already proven she belonged there. Sometimes the very prejudice meant to hold us back ends up putting us exactly where we need to be to change the world. The girl they tried to push to the back of the plane had instead flown it home.